Welcome everyone to another session of our Global Employability Expert Series. So today we have a really interesting session and I am really looking forward to it. But first of all, let's remember how it works, okay? So we are recording this webinar so you can watch it again later on, or you can share it with someone you think can benefit from watching it. We are also having a moment for questions. We will have a speaker, he will share their knowledge with us, and then we will have a moment of questions. Please share these questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, okay? If you want to make any comments on the chats, that's okay, but we will only take the questions that are in the Q&A, okay? If you have any questions relating your program, please reach out to your IM. The IM is the person who has been emailing you and sharing all the information about the program. So please reach out to them if you have any specific question. And remember, you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel where you will find our previous webinars and where we will upload this webinar once we have the recording. Okay. So now we know how it works. Let's see what our webinar is going to be about today. So our webinar is going to be about how to pave your path into the tech industry. This is a really interesting topic. I understand that many of you have done perhaps a bootcamp or have some experience in doing some kind of training in IT. So we hope this is a really relevant webinar for you. And so let's meet our speaker who is going to share their experience with us. So our speaker is Steve Abrams, and Steve is a software engineer working out of Denver, Colorado in the United States. He changed careers, pivoting from mechanical engineering 6 years after graduating college, and has successfully worked his way up to a premier tech company. Outside of work, Steve enjoys spending time with his family, reading, and getting outside, hiking, camping, and skiing. And so what he will talk specifically, let's see. So after more than 6 years working in the IT industry, Steve has created a really interesting career path and has learned many things about how to be successful in this field. In this presentation, he will share his path to becoming a software engineer, what skills you need to succeed in this field, some job search and networking tips, and much more. So without further ado, welcome, Steve.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. And as mentioned today, I'm going to share a bit about my path as a software engineer and a few lessons that I've learned along the way in the professional world. And I'm also going to share some tips about searching for your first few jobs. I've been a software engineer at GitLab for just about 3 years, and I'm considering working towards either the management track or continuing on the individual contributor track as I move forward in my career. I write software that helps companies build and store their software packages, dependencies, and other items on the GitLab DevOps platform. 10 years ago, I was designing industrial pumps and that would be used in mines and chemical plants. So how did I end up becoming a software engineer at a growing and recently public company? Let's take a step back. So 13 years ago, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. 13 years ago was 2009, which meant that I graduated fresh into the recession that was happening in the US. And that started in the fall of 2008. So it made finding a job that spring and summer very difficult. The entire economy was affected by this recession, but I was youthfully ignorant of all of that and did not understand why I did not automatically get a job right out of college. My dream was to get into aerospace, working on the kinds of missions that Carl Sagan was known for, maybe working at NASA or the Jet Propulsion Labs. And I applied to literally hundreds of jobs, but it just never happened. And I felt devastated and bitter. I thought that college was what had failed me rather than the greater economy. And during my year or two of underemployment after school, I was trying to come up with things that might make my resume look better. So a friend of mine was a software engineer, and he suggested I learn a programming language. So I worked through a PHP development book, which I quite liked in comparison to the C++ course I had taken in college. I recall thinking in college that I don't understand how anyone would want to write code for a living. But after learning how web development worked, it kind of changed my perspective. So a few months later, I found myself working at Starbucks, making no progress on my job hunt. And I got a call from an old classmate. She was changing roles in her company and they needed someone to fill her old position. So I was finally able to get my foot into the door with the mechanical engineering industry. And the job was designing industrial pumping equipment. I quickly learned that this industry was not what I had imagined it to be, but it was very interesting, or what was very interesting was how much it taught me about the world beyond school. I was able to learn how companies function, how sales, marketing, product development, and engineering all come together to make something that people need. And I also learned quite a bit about my own ignorance. It was an industry I never would have imagined myself in, but yet I found myself flying around, visiting mines and power plants, discussing designs with machinists who had been in the manufacturing industry for over 30 years. And the amount of information I gained at that job was invaluable. So that brings me to the first lesson I learned, which is no matter what your goals and plans are, don't expect them to happen exactly how you think they will. It's good to have goals and something to aspire towards, but use them as a guide, not as a measurement of success. And if you recall, I was working at Starbucks 1 year after I graduated with a college degree. Well, it just so happens that that's where I met my wife, and it was one of the best years of my life. So you never know what paths might lie before you, but it's important to treat them all with equal respect and gratitude. So a year or two after my job at the pump company, I noticed a big problem. They were using Rolodexes and Excel spreadsheets and Microsoft Access, which for database, which wasn't really working to organize all of their engineering drawings and documents. It was a 100-year-old company, so you can't really blame them. But I thought back to what I had taught myself with PHP and realized I could probably build a simple database-driven application to replace the entire system. I pitched the idea, but no one seemed to understand why it was so great. So I asked my software engineering friend for some more advice, and he told me to learn Ruby on Rails, which would allow me to quickly build exactly what I was talking about. So I spent some time outside of work building the app and then struggled through figuring out how to actually deploy it at the company. But once I had it and had shown them, they were pretty excited and started using it right away. And to my knowledge, they are still using it today. And it was at that moment that I realized that building that app was the most fun I'd ever had working. And I thought, if only I could do that for a living, that would be so great. So I asked my friend for advice again, and he told me about these coding boot camps that were starting to pop up around the country. And he said that there was one in particular that had really good results and that he would hire anyone coming out of it as an entry-level software engineer. So I looked into it, and I would have to quit my job and have no income for 6 months. I had already been out of college for 5 years at this point. I was still in debt from my college degree. I, at this point, had a small mortgage on a house, a car payment. I was married. So the idea was super scary. The program cost 20,000 US dollars, and you had to pay everything up front. It wasn't an accredited school. So it was a bit worrisome to kind of take that kind of a risk. But it was so new that they interestingly had a money back guarantee that you not only would get a job, but also get a job as a developer, making a very specific salary as a minimum. And interestingly enough, the guaranteed salary was more than I was making at my mechanical engineering job. So I decided the risk was probably worthwhile. I visited an open house and talked to some other students, and they were building things that I never imagined myself being capable of building after just 6 months' time. So I decided to go for it, but the problem was still, how do I come up not only with the money to pay for the course, but to pay for my life outside of school for 6 months. The money for the course was easy. There's loans set up for that, but the life part was a little bit harder. Luckily, I did own a small house that had gone up in value, so I was able to take out a loan on my mortgage and then use that to pay off my mortgage. And if you're wondering, That is definitely not how those loans are supposed to work. So if either lender had found out, I would have lost my home and all of my money. So I don't endorse that idea. But the point is, I took a calculated risk, and there were a few outcomes that were very obvious in my mind. I would either get a job making more money than before and then be able to pay back all of my loans. I would not get a job, but due to the money back guarantee, I would get the course money back, and then hopefully I could get another job or my old job back and be able to pay back my loans. Or everything would go wrong. I wouldn't get a job. I'd have to sell my house. I'd lose everything, and I'd end up having to move, I don't know, to an apartment, or who knows. The third option was a legitimate concern, but it seemed pretty unlikely given all the facts about the program, my history, and my own personal work ethic. I was one of the older students, but that also meant that I was the most driven to succeed. So I put in time every single night and weekend to learn and grow as much as I could. I shut down my social life for 6 months, didn't really do anything fun. But when I graduated, the instructors held me as one of their top 3 students. And in contrast to the struggle that I had getting a job out of college, the economy was booming in 2015. And the startup industry where I live was flourishing. So I was able to get quite a few interviews and job offers after attending just a single job fair. I almost couldn't believe how different it was. And so that takes me to my second lesson, which is take calculated risks. There's always a way to change your path. You just have to put in the work. Sometimes it's really hard, like taking on massive debt or losing time with your loved ones. But it's important that when you make a calculated decision, you commit to it and see it through. And at different times in life, these types of risks might make more or less sense. Like right now I have kids, and I'm a little bit older, so I don't know if I would be willing to risk losing my house and everything on changing a career. But it doesn't mean that I wouldn't be able to change my path. So my first job out of the boot camp was at a local startup, working on a programming language that I did not learn in my boot camp. And once again, similar to the pump company, working on a product that I knew absolutely nothing about. But in this case, I was able to just soak up new information. I found out that a lot of the work was database intensive. So I took it upon myself to learn that skill from my boss and from a few other people. It was also at this job that I learned how web applications are deployed and distributed throughout the world using tools like AWS and Azure and Google Cloud. After about a year in the position, I ended up leaving and joining my friend who had inspired my entire journey thus far. It was a 5-person consulting company, so it was very small, and I had no choice but to learn how to talk to customers, learn how to manage and deploy applications on myself, and essentially be on call for 24/7 for any possible emergency. My skills as a developer grew substantially during that time. And my friend was also a purist when it came to staying on the bleeding edge of technology. So unlike all of the larger companies I had interviewed at, my friend's company had succeeded in implementing their applications using like all of the top front-end frameworks, exactly how they were laid out and imagined when I was in school. So I learned that keeping things up to date, testing for bugs, and testing code in general was paramount to keeping applications running for customers. I also started to learn about the importance of communication, in that I had to keep customers informed and constantly keep everyone updated about the status of things. Eventually, I found myself getting an offer at GitLab, and GitLab has been a life-changing role for me. It's the largest company I've ever worked for, despite not being like a massive company like some companies are. So the amount of process that was in place compared to previous companies I had been at was substantial. I originally viewed larger companies as bureaucratic and slow, but what I ended up learning was that if you define processes well and consider them to be fluid, they can boost productivity beyond what you thought was possible without them. Questions are automatically answered, people don't need to check with other people about decisions, and everyone knows what everyone else is responsible for. I also experienced my first true code reviews at GitLab, which felt like a kick in the gut the first few times. And I was quite certain that I was the worst developer there was because of the amount of feedback and suggestions that I was getting. But I soon learned that I wasn't the only one getting that type of feedback. Everyone was getting that type of feedback. And it wasn't necessarily people just trying to like push their opinions or show other people that they were wrong. Everyone was collaborating to try to make everyone else's code better and try to help everyone learn to become better engineers, which I think is just super cool. I ended up also being able to utilize my previous learnings regarding databases from my first job, and I worked my way up to being a maintainer of the code at GitLab with regard to database changes. So I consider that to be one of the highlights of my career and its accomplishment, where I can look back and see all of those years of growth and education paying off. And so that brings me to my third lesson here, which is always be learning. If you're not learning, consider making a change. This could be anything from asking for new work or different work, to switching departments, finding a new job, or even finding a new career. At every point in my career, I have something I can point to and say that it was worthwhile. Even better, I can frame these things in a way that might be attractive to potential employers or help me along my career path that I have envisioned for myself. And if you're not growing, not only will your career stay still, it can actually degrade over time. It's kind of like money sitting still instead of being invested. It'll just start to go down in value over a long period of time. So that's my story, and thanks for listening. Those were 3 lessons that didn't become apparent to me until much after I lived through them. So I hope that perhaps they can help you. And the last thing that I learned was that looking back, even though I kind of see myself as having such a unique path, I've learned through talking with everyone else that I've worked with along the way that everyone has a unique path. It's rare that I've met someone who has that standard path that I had imagined in my head when I was in college. So next, I want to jump into another topic. I've shared a few lessons that I learned along the way, and now I'll share a few direct lessons for maybe once you have a job. In my career, I've noticed a few things that make great employees stand out from everyone else. The first one is communication. I can't really understate the importance of being able to communicate well. Being able to collaborate and communicate with your team and your managers can make the difference between being an average employee and an exceptional one. It's funny how the world of software development can look like you're spending a lot of time just alone writing code, but yet to be excellent at it, you have to be really good at communicating your ideas and being proactive about it. A single person can create the best app or tool in the world, but unless they can work with others and communicate with them, they'll never be able to market it, sell it, or scale it on their own. The second thing that I've noticed is confidence. Confidence is not always what it seems, but respect often follows confidence. Sometimes confidence looks like, admitting that you just didn't know something or asking what seems like a stupid question. It shows that you want to be helpful and not just look good. And it can bring a lot of respect from others. And then also don't forget to look back at what you've done in the past. Being in the tech world and the IT industry, things move so fast that you can often forget what you worked on even just last week. So looking back at your accomplishments can help prevent things like imposter syndrome, which I certainly fought a lot with in the past. And it can keep you centered on your own career development. The last thing that I'll mention is focus on results, not just doing work. So at my very first job at the pump company, on my first day, I asked my boss what time I was expected to show up and leave every day. And I'll never forget his answer. He said, "Look, we're all professionals here, and I expect you to be a professional too," which meant he didn't need me to be in an exact time. He just needed me to do my job. Being busy doesn't make you better or a more attractive employee, but producing results with real evidence does. So you can think about it if you look at how you might phrase some work you did, or how you might even decide what type of work to do. I could say something like, I spent 100 hours refactoring code last week. Well, that was a lot of work, but what did it actually do? It might be better that I could say something like, I decided against doing any refactoring after analyzing that there was no net gain of implementing new code and there would be no performance or scalability improvements. That shows there's an actual impact with the decision I made. It's not just I did something, it's I did something for a reason. And then obviously the best result is that you can show that your results made an improvement. So if I were to be able to say something like, I decided to spend a few hours on one small section because I determined it had the biggest impact on performance. And since then, we've improved response times by 50%. That's the kind of thing that you really want to be able to show off and say that you've done. So I'll finish off on sharing a few things that I've learned along the way looking for jobs. I've gone through starting 2 careers, so I've had the opportunity to look for my first job twice. And these are some things that are a little bit more practical than the philosophical lessons I've kind of shared up to now. So these are things you can kind of start doing right away. The first thing is just remember that the job hunt is all about perseverance and patience. The professional world is big and it can be hard to get noticed, land an interview, and once you're in an interview, prove that you're as good as your resume says you are. The key is to keep moving and don't let rejection and disappointment get you down. As long as you stay focused and positive, things will eventually happen. And it really is just a numbers game. You just have to keep pushing out more and more resumes to more and more companies. It can be helpful to think about it from the aspect of, like one offer can come from every 5 interviews, one interview might come from every 3 phone screens, and one phone screen might come from every 10 applications. But once you actually look at how many applications that is, that means you've applied to 150 jobs. Like, hopefully that's not what you end up seeing, but having those numbers in mind can kind of help you stay focused and driven towards the end result of getting that job. And then when it comes to getting those interviews, you want to be involved in as many things as possible. I call it casting many nets. So this is anything from networking to having your resume set up for every single application you send in, to working with alternative methods, LinkedIn, having a blog, having your Twitter account be relevant to your job search. So I would recommend with things like LinkedIn, connect with everyone in your class, everyone involved in your internships, give each other endorsements on some of the skills you have listed. These are things that people will notice if they're looking at your LinkedIns. And I think LinkedIn's do seem to have taken over in the tech world quite a bit in certain areas. Twitter isn't a bad place to be. Follow companies that you like, leaders that you look up to, and share some posts showing your interests. If there's other social media that people in the industry that you are interested in are using, get involved in those too to show that you're interested in as well. And then when it comes to things like business cards, it's really just about having like a personal touch, something that like makes you stand out, so that if you meet someone, they kind of remember that you were different in some specific way. One other note about social media is that I would say is you should clean it up or make it private. So not everyone will look at your social media accounts, but you don't want someone to decide to look closer at your resume, then open up your Facebook account and see something you did a few years ago in your personal life and then decide to stop reading your resume. That's not a good reason to not get a job. So it's a good idea to just clean things up or just go ahead and make them private while you're looking for a job at least. So I'll dig in a little bit more on networking, because I think networking coming out of school is something that was super confusing to me. What I ended up learning is that it looks a lot like not looking for a job. Eventually, or it's essentially just meeting people, chatting with them, being interested in what they do, asking questions, and being likable. I absolutely hated the idea that networking would get people jobs rather than pure qualifications when I graduated from school. I thought that if I was good enough, I should be hired, end of story. But the funny thing is, if you recall, what ended up getting me my first job was a girl from my class who I did not keep in touch with after school, contacted me on LinkedIn 2 years after graduation and asked if I was interested in a job at her company. Her boss trusted her and she remembered me being smart and friendly, and that was all it took. When it comes to your resume, I would consider this to be one of the worst parts of the job hunt because it's so tedious to keep up with. And as much as I hate to admit it, you do need to tailor your resume for every job you apply for. Everything on it should be framed in a way that proves you match the qualifications they're looking for. Don't be afraid to add unrelated experience. If you're just graduating from school, you don't have a ton of experience, but you want to fill that page. And you never know what experience might be relevant for who's looking at your application. If you worked the same job for the last 5 years, some people will think that that shows stability. It will show that you're less likely to leave their company after 1 or 2 years. I know that I continued to put my mechanical engineering experience on my resume, and that ended up paying off. When I finished my code bootcamp, a lot of companies that interviewed me were very interested in the idea that I had professional experience, that I had technical experience, and that I had a technical degree, even if it had nothing to do with what they were doing. And you really just need to tune into what makes you different. A great example is these internships. It differentiates you from other students, but I would take it even deeper than that. What differentiates you from other people that are in this webinar right now who also have the internship experience? What did you do during yours that was truly unique? To note about job descriptions, when you're looking at job descriptions, you'll often see things that say like requires 1 to 2 years of experience. I would ignore that. People always make exceptions for the right person. And when it comes to adding those 1 to 2 years of experience, you've been in school. Some people will count that as real experience. You never know. And if you don't know some of the terms listed or some of the lingo on the job description, ignore that too. People are notoriously bad at writing job descriptions. Most of the time they end up including information that they themselves didn't know until they worked at the company, but they're cursed with kind of the knowledge that they can't forget what they now know. And my last piece of advice is never stop interviewing. Even once you have a job, and if you love your job, still keep it up. Maybe once a year, try to get an interview at a job. It's a skill, and it's important to practice and brush up on it because you never know when you might need it. And you might even need it to start interviewing other people to hire at your company. It also helps promote networking. After I finished my code bootcamp, I ended up turning down 1 or 2 jobs. And 5 years later, one of the interviewers found me on LinkedIn and asked if I would interview at his new company. So you never know how these networking relationships might pay off. And then last, when it comes to interviews, remember that you're interviewing the company just as much as they're interviewing you. That can be hard to keep in mind when you're first getting your first job offers, but you don't want to take a job prematurely if it's not the right fit for you. So that's all I have for you today. So I want to say thanks again for having me, and I will hand it back over to Nita.
Thanks, Steve. That was great. You shared so many interesting pieces of information. That's great. I really liked something you shared about job descriptions, right? When we're looking for our first job, sometimes we feel that we need to have absolutely all the requirements, right? Everything they're looking for. What do you think about that? Is it so, or can we apply even if we don't have all the requirements?
I think you can absolutely apply if you don't have all the requirements. There's not a single job I've gotten where I met the requirements. My first job as a mechanical engineer, they were looking for 3 to 5 years experience. I had 0. I believe when I started at GitLab, they were looking for more years of experience with a specific programming language that I had. And it's very uncommon, or it's very common to have that happen, where a company writes their job description, but then in going through applicants, what they want in reality is they want someone who will be able to grow into the role and do well. Gaining 1 year of experience is something that can happen very quickly, but finding someone that can excel in a role that has the right sort of personality, maybe fits the company culture, that's much harder to do.
Yeah, and actually there are many people who say that if you have already all the requirements, you're overqualified, right? You're probably for the next role. And you mentioned also something interesting about, well, we may refrain ourselves from applying to a job because it asks for 1 or 2 years of professional experience that when we leave college, we don't have, right? And at the moment, I think it's really important to consider for instance, leadership activities, right? Things we did during university, if we were part of perhaps a volunteering organization, and any achievements we might have. So how do you think we can make up this lack of experience, but to say, okay, you mentioned something about showing really clearly the skills we have, right?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two aspects of it. You've got your resume, and then you've got when you actually talk to someone. So the resume is what has to catch someone's eye and decide to talk to you. So you have to put things in there that match what they're looking for close enough, so that they think like, okay, it looks like this person has the skills I need or that I expect for this job. I'm going to talk to them and see if that's actually true, essentially. So yeah, I mean, don't lie on the resume and don't just put every qualification on there. But you can frame things like you mentioned. If you happened to work on a big project in school, you can put that on your resume. I recall my first resume out of school, out of my boot camp. Instead of having like experience with my companies listed, I had projects, and I had 5 different projects I had worked on listed, with links to where they could see the code if they wanted to. And that ended up actually being the main thing we talked about during interviews, was because they weren't necessarily interested in what number of years of experience I had. They wanted to know how technical I was. So they were able to dig into those things. And then once you're talking about them, you do have experience with a lot of things. It's all about how you frame things. So like I was able to use examples from my mechanical engineering experience to show how I could communicate well with others, how I can work with non-engineering and technical people and communicate that technical requirements and talk about the different projects I'm working on. And those are skills that aren't necessarily taught directly in school, but a professional employer will notice those types of things.
Yeah, and you mentioned something really important about communication, no? And communication means being able to communicate your skills. And when we think about skills, sometimes it's a bit confusing because we said, okay, I'm not sure what my skills are. I think that a good exercise to do is to consider, like you said, projects or activities we undertook and said, okay, what did I need to do here, and what knowledge did I apply? What I could actually achieve and how I did it. And then we will find a skill. And we definitely need to tailor, like you mentioned, our resume or CV to match the skills the role the company is looking for. Because I've interviewed many people and I've received many emails. And from the job description we shared and the CV, in the CV, there was absolutely no reference to the skills that the job required. And perhaps the person had a software engineer degree, but in the CV, that was not really taken advantage, right? And so when you think about communicating our skills or even what we can do you have any tips or things we can do to practice on how to improve?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is kind of looking at like what is underneath the skill on the surface level. Because if a job requires like, you can write JavaScript code, you could write in your resume or cover letter, I have experience writing JavaScript code. That's good, it meets the requirement, but it doesn't necessarily tell them anything about you or why you are better than anyone else for this position. So you want to look at, okay, what experience do I have writing that? Is there anything that I can show that shows a particular degree of competence? Did I do something that was kind of unique or interesting? Or like, and even if only you thought it was interesting, it could be worth mentioning. You could say, like one thing you could bring up is like, if you had a team project, maybe it wasn't the most interesting project you worked on, but if you were the person that was kind of directing the team, you can put that in your resume and say like, oh, I led the team and we were able to accomplish creating this project in a amount of time that would have not been possible for one person. And we were able to do it clearly and efficiently and give some details on the results of that project. And then that shows that you have leadership competency and can go beyond the just I worked on a project kind of line.
Yeah, that's super important, being able to share the results. And I think that for job interviews, it's really important to prepare. Even if we don't have previous job experience, we still need to prepare. And many times in a job interview, we may face a question that is something like, tell me a time where you had a challenge and you solved it. And perhaps it's not necessarily a super challenging thing we did at a specific work, but it's something, I don't know, a communication issue with my colleagues at university, and I need to be able to clearly explain what the problem was, what I did, how I solved it. So when thinking of job interviews, be sure to really reflect on many experiences. You can really Google like the most 50 asked question in job interviews, and you can find a lot of different examples on how you can answer this. But it's super important to prepare for a job interview and prepare having in mind everything that Steve is sharing, right? How we can use our previous experiences, even if they're not really work experiences, how we can communicate our skills and so on. So see, we have a really interesting question from the audience. It says, I am self-studying programming right now. I do not have technical background, so I do not expect to have an experience in a job. How can I make projects that are useful for me, that I can show as an experience?
Yeah, so I would suggest certainly having like a GitHub, GitLab, one of those types of accounts to be able to publish your projects publicly too, so people can look at them. And then when it comes to making the project, don't be too ambitious. You want to just pick one small thing. So you're not looking to make like a full website that does everything, has authentication and security set up and all sorts of like a fancy user interface. You just want to prove one aspect of something you can do. So maybe it's a website that, like shows that you can interact with an external API system. So you can like pull in data from another source. It doesn't look pretty. It doesn't do anything else at all. And maybe there's even buttons that don't work, but there's one aspect of the code that kind of shines. And that's what you want to publish and then put in your resume as like, this is a project that demonstrates that certain skill and that level of knowledge. Creating a handful of those little projects that do one or two things each that are varied, that can be super helpful. It can certainly fill out your resume, and then it can give a lot of sort of proof that you know what you're doing technically.
Yeah, thank you. So someone is asking a little bit more about networking. What are the key points we should consider? I really like something you said, that networking, you said a keyword that I consider is really the way it should be, which is be friendly, be amicable with people you meet, right? And that will make you, people will remember you. And that's kind of the sort of the point of networking, right? What do you think?
Yeah, it's weird because it's not like I'm trying to get a job from you right now. You might not even have a job or the ability to hire anyone at this point. I found something that was useful when I finished my code bootcamp. I ended up, there were a lot of people that were kind of in that ecosystem of that bootcamp from different companies. So I ended up just like messaging them and asking, hey, can we go get coffee? I'm kind of curious about what you do for a living. And I would meet up with these people for like 30 minutes to an hour at a coffee shop and just have a set of questions about like, what do you do? What do you like about what you do? How did you get to where you are? Do you have any advice? Things like that. And that's it. That's essentially the entire networking process. And then hopefully, maybe you connect on LinkedIn or you get their email or phone number to keep in contact in the future. But that's pretty much all there is to it. Just constantly keeping up those little tiny relationships with people. And then eventually you never know when or how they might pay off. But the real answer is that when it comes time for someone to look to hire people, people want to hire people that they know, even if they only know them a little bit. So they can look back and say like, oh, I remember Steve, like I chatted with him once. He was super nice. He loved the tech industry. He was learning all these cool things. Maybe we should call him instead of just cold calling, these 50 people that dropped a resume in. And that's kind of how that can all work.
Yeah, and what you're saying about meeting with someone and ask about their path, that is super, super useful. Well, technically, that's what we may call an informational interview. So if you all hear sometimes speaking about informational interviews, it is basically meeting with someone to have a conversation. You're not going to ask for a job, right? Because sometimes that can be a little bit intimidating. And if you don't know the person, it can be a little bit weird. Like, I don't know you, but I want a job from you. It can be a little bit even too much, right? But if you approach the conversation from this perspective of, oh, I think you do a really interesting job in a really interesting industry, and I would love to know more about that. And you can actually start networking from your internship right now, right? You can really make sure that you, first of all, have a LinkedIn profile, that you list this internship experience in your LinkedIn profile, that you start following your host company, start following many other companies in the industry you want to explore. And even you can have an informational interview with your supervisor, right? If your supervisor has an interesting career, you can say, I would love to have 20 minutes, make a Zoom call to explore how you did it, what strategies you put in place. Do you have any piece of advice for me who I'm finishing university and I'm just giving my first professional steps? So those kind of interactions are super, super important. And one thing I do to connect with more people, when there are webinars or seminars, even if they're online or in person, but I cannot attend, or even if I can attend, I check the list of speakers and I put all of them in my LinkedIn account or follow them, right? So everything I see, I have more people to follow. So that's something you can do. And see, someone is wondering, how was it for you to manage all this, uncertainty, the doubts when you were lost after, you had your degree and then you realized that was not what you wanted to do, how you felt at the moment, and how you did to really take courage to say, I need to explore something different.
Yeah, it was difficult. Like looking back, it's easy to say, oh, that was a great decision and everything worked out so well. But at the time, I felt very stuck in my career, which I don't know whether or not that was true. It just felt like I was in this industry that I didn't intend to be in. And the longer that I was there, I thought the more I would probably be kind of stuck with that subset of engineering companies. I don't know if that's true in retrospect, but that's kind of the mindset I had. And then what really ended up happening was I became super interested in code. And through doing it kind of on the side as a hobby, that's kind of what led me to wanting to do it professionally. I spent probably a good year and a half sort of thinking about the idea of moving to it professionally, just sort of working it on my own. And at some point I realized, like, if I actually want to do it to the point where I can get a job, I need to really like focus some time. I can't just spend a couple hours a week trying to teach myself these things. I need to, spend a legitimate amount of time upping my skills for a few months to be able to do it. And the bootcamp system kind of added the aspect of not only forcing me to focus for those few months, but also adding the structure of what I needed to learn. Because that was kind of one of the other questions, was I was kind of learning whatever I found out about, but I didn't know, I didn't know what I didn't know. So the boot camp helped with that a lot. And then when it came to the decision itself, it definitely was a bit scary. I had a lot of discussions with my wife and with my family about whether or not this was a good idea. And it really came down to weighing those risks and making sure that I understood the outcomes. It wasn't just like a blind decision. I knew the potential ways that this would end up when I was doing it. So that's kind of how all that came to be.
Yeah. And okay, so we have a more specific question. Someone wants to know what coding bootcamp you attended to.
I attended Galvanize. I'm not sure how widespread they are. There's quite a few campuses in the US, and I know they have a virtual program as well. But I went through their 6-month full stack web development program.
And I have more of a very specific question. Someone wants to know if PHP can replace Python. I'm not sure what this question is about. I don't understand much, but what do you think?
That I don't know. I mean, they're both two different programming languages. Most of the time, programming languages can solve the same problems in different ways. So I don't know about replace. I think they're both kind of equal, and they both have their advantages and disadvantages for depending on what you're building or trying to do. Like Python right now is really big in the sort of machine learning and sort of big data science kind of fields. PHP was always kind of one of the go-tos for prototyping web applications and web pages. So they both have their different strengths.
Okay, thanks for that. So, I really liked what you said about really being conscious that each person has their own specific path relating to career development, because I think that's a sort of in my opinion, a myth, right? That there's only one way to your career, one way your career should be, or perhaps even if we, like in your case, you went to university, you made a great investment, because we know that in the United States, you need to ask for a loan, which is insane. So you worked a lot, and then probably you said, okay, I need to make this work, right? I need to make this engineering degree. I need to work on this. But that's a way of perhaps like you definitely did. It's like you were limiting yourself to just one path. And I don't know, but perhaps with all these ideas, that, oh, if I did this, then I have to work on this, and this is the only way it can go. So can you elaborate a little bit more on this idea that each person has a different path, and how you did to really incorporate this?
Yeah, I think sort of one of the things that I always remember hearing was that like there's a certain percentage of people that like the jobs or the careers they end up in have nothing to do with their college degrees or what they ended up studying. And I remember at first thinking like that didn't make much sense, but as time goes by and you have more and more years outside of school, it starts to make more and more sense. Oftentimes, you'll see someone have an entry-level job, which is very applicable to what they studied, and then they quickly branch off into a different area. I think that's probably the most common thing I've seen in my career is someone might start out as a software engineer and then very quickly move into product management, because instead of just writing code, they like actually managing how the product is designed and created over time, and where they enjoy talking to people about it. They enjoy talking to customers. Alternatively, some people move right up into management. They like to work with people. They like to grow other people. They don't necessarily like to be in the tedious details. They want to be in the sort of more abstract, bigger area of just organizing everything. And then in most industries, there's such a wide variety of different positions that you don't even become aware of them until you're working. Like I know as a software engineer, I had never even heard of a solutions architect, which might be called different things at different places, but it's a job where someone who's very technically minded will talk to big enterprise customers or users about how they might be able to use your product. So they're working with like, companies of thousands of people saying like, okay, if you want to start using this, how do we solve the problem of taking this product and getting 5,000 people to use it? And I thought that was a very interesting position that I'd never even known about. So I think that's one of the most common ways that people kind of end up changing their paths. When it comes to a full career sort of flip, I think that kind of depends on what the career change is, because certainly there are some careers where like you have to go to school for them. You can't be a doctor unless you go to medical school. And there's a lot of careers like that, but then there's a lot that are not. Like the software industry, the tech industry is very much open to, if you have the skills, you can have the job essentially. And so I know a lot of people that I work with that are writing code or doing product management that studied completely different things. They studied philosophy, they studied business. Business is actually a big one because that essentially, if you end up working in a technical field with a business degree, that sets you up to go up the management track if you're wanting to. So I guess in the end, there's so many different possibilities once you kind of have your eyes opened to the professional world. And that's kind of what makes all those paths so unique and different.
Yeah, that's a great idea to wrap up our webinar. This idea of really start exploring and being open to different opportunities and possibilities, because we won't know what we like doing until we start doing it. Sometimes we have this super cliche phrase that says, okay, do what you love and you won't work one single day for the rest of your life. That is great, but how do I find out what I love and what I like, right? And some people may already know, but well, if you're more like me and perhaps like Steve, you're not really clear about what is it that I really like. And we start discovering what we like when we start doing it, right? Perhaps we started in a role that at the beginning we didn't think it was for us, and then we started having different approaches and said, oh, okay, I really like this. And many things we don't even know they exist, right? Like Steve shared about this position that you said, okay, I didn't even know this existed. So it is really good to be open and also reconcile yourself with the fact that it is okay sometimes to be lost, to not know. And in the path we start discovering, and that's how we hopefully get to discover what we like and then start creating a path that works for us. So Steve, how can we stay in contact with you if we want to reach out to you? I think we have your LinkedIn here, that's right. So here we have Steve's information if you want to stay in touch with him and perhaps ask him any other question. And so let me remind you that we have all our previous webinars that you can check in our YouTube channel. And also remember that if you want to talk about career development and have a time for yourself and explore how your internship is going, you have 2 coaching calls included in your program, okay? You will receive this, the email to book these coaching calls. If you have any doubts, please send us an email. And after this, you will also receive an email explaining more about the coaching calls, because that's really good for you to reflect on your career development. Steve, I want to thank you enormously for being here. It was a super, super interesting webinar, and I think our participants really liked it. So really, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone, and I wish you have an excellent day and see you again in our next webinar. Bye.